Back in November of 2019, if you had looked at the Billboard music charts during that time, you would have seen sitting right at the top the following three words: Jesus is King. Because Kanye West, who had previously released album after album with parental advisory labels because of all the graphic content in them, had just released an entirely different kind of album. It was an album proclaiming the kingship and the lordship of Jesus, and it also was the top-selling album in the world during that time. In fact, on the night when the album was released, Kanye made a special, unexpected appearance on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, and during their discussion as he's promoting this new album, Kimmel asked him, "Do you consider yourself to be a Christian music artist now?" And without hesitation, Kanye said, "I'm a Christian everything. I'm just a Christian everything." So back in the fall of 2019, by all accounts, it seemed as though Kanye had experienced the transforming grace of Jesus. It seemed as though his life was headed in a new direction. But nearly 5 years later, in the spring of 2024, it became clear that Kanye had reverted back to his old style of music because it was now riddled with graphic content and profanity once again. And during a radio interview, he was asked about that previous album, which was all about Jesus, and he was asked about his experience with Christianity, and he said this: "I have my issues with Jesus. There's a lot of stuff that I went through, and I prayed, and I didn't see Jesus show up." And then he said this: "I am the God of me. You cannot tell me who I am. I am the God of me." So clearly, a lot can change in just 5 years. From 2019 to 2024, Kanye West went from proclaiming Jesus is King to proclaiming I am the God of me. And according to this radio interview, the reason for that is because he was going through some difficult times, and he concluded that Jesus didn't show up for him. He was experiencing challenging and confusing things in his personal life, and apparently he cried out to God, he prayed to God during those times, and he just felt like God left him out to dry, and because of that, he chose to kiss Christianity goodbye. Have you ever felt that way before? Have you ever felt like during challenging and confusing times you called out to the Lord in prayer, but Jesus just didn't show up? Almost as though God had just left you out to dry. If you have felt that way before, or if you are even maybe feeling that way right now, then this final vignette in the book of Genesis, which focuses on the life of Jesus, should be a portion of your Bible that you cling to with all of your might. Last week, we took a look at Genesis 35, which is the final chapter of the Genesis story where Jacob is the focal point of the narrative, which means that beginning today, although Jacob, whose name has been changed to Israel in the story, he's still around and he's actually still in the narrative of our passage today, but he's now fading into the background, and the focus of the narrative is taking a decisive shift. So Jacob is still alive until chapter 49, but now things are going to take a shift and focus on Jacob's 11th son, Joseph. But one of the things that we saw last week was the fact that even though Jacob was this complicated character and he's been a scoundrel in so many ways throughout this story, at the end of the day, if he did get anything right, the main thing that he got right was to pass along his faith in God's covenant promises to the next generation. And because he did that, his son Joseph, his story is all about the sovereign, providential care of God and Joseph's unwavering faith in his promises. Now, you may have noticed that we're skipping over chapter 36 and actually going straight to chapter 37. The reason we're doing that is not because chapter 36 doesn't matter. Every chapter in the Bible matters. There's always something that could be gleaned. But within the overall narrative of Genesis, chapter 36 is really a bridge between the story of Jacob and the story of Joseph, because it is mostly a genealogy which shows us what became of Jacob's brother Esau. So that's the last time in the narrative where we hear Esau's name and Esau's descendants. It kind of tells us what happens to him and his family, who are called the Edomites. So I would encourage you on your own time, go ahead and read through that chapter. There's a long genealogy in there showing us what became of Esau's family. But I will just quickly mention this, that in verses 6 through 8 of chapter 36, Moses tells us that after burying their father Isaac, Jacob and Esau wind up separating for the same reason that Abram and Lot separated back in Genesis 13. It says that both of them had so many livestock and possessions that the land could not support both of their households living in that same place together. And so because of the fact that the covenant promises had been passed on to Jacob specifically, that meant that he and his household would remain in that promised land of Canaan, while Esau's household chose to depart from there and head to a different country called Seir and settle there. And that's the end of the portion of the story where we have that relationship between Jacob and Esau that officially brings their story to a close. Now, as we walk through our passage this morning, chapter 37, we're going to explore this passage in two movements. So first, we're going to see one spoiled dreamer in verses 1 through 11. And second, we're going to see 10 jealous schemers in verses 12 through 36. One spoiled dreamer and 10 jealous schemers. So we'll dive into that first part of our passage and see how Moses presents us with one spoiled dreamer in verses 1 through 11 of Genesis 37. Beginning in verse 1. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. One of the keys to understanding the overall structure of the book of Genesis and what Moses has done throughout this story is the Hebrew word toledot. In our English translations, it's typically translated as the word generations or descendants, and the book as a whole is kind of held together by these 10 different generational or toledot sections, and it starts all the way back in chapter 2, where it says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created." And then in chapter 5, it says, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." And then moving on from there, Moses does this 8 more times throughout the entire story. These are the generations of Noah. These are the generations of the sons of Noah. These are the generations of Shem. These are the generations of Terah, and so forth, all the way until our passage this morning, which presents us with the 10th and final toledot section of the book. These are the generations of Jacob. Which means we've officially reached the final section of the book of Genesis, and from here on out, the rest of the story, Moses is now focusing on the sons of Jacob all the way until the end, and really specifically on his 11th son, Joseph. Now, we're told here that at this point in time, Joseph was 17 years old, and he was working as a shepherd in the land of Canaan alongside some of his brothers. And then pretty quickly here, Moses provides us with some helpful intel for us to get a feel for the inward working dynamics of the relationships within this family. And he does so with 2 primary details in the text. So the first detail is the fact that Joseph brought a bad report about his brothers to his father Jacob. Now, on its face, that might sound ambiguous enough, but this Hebrew phrase actually has connotations of malicious intent. So when we read that, we're not supposed to picture Joseph as just like this sweet, innocent little angel who has no bad intentions, no motivations of any kind other than the purest motivations when he does something like this. Most likely, we're meant to see Joseph as kind of a brown-nosing, spoiled little tattletale who's trying to get his brothers in trouble. In fact, some commentators think that this bad report is not only a malicious thing, but it's also specifically a false report, which would mean that Joseph is either exaggerating some details to his father or maybe even fabricating details solely for the purpose of getting his brothers in trouble with their father. But at a minimum, Joseph was definitely, at least, a brown-nosing, spoiled tattletale who frankly deserved a good wedgie from his older brothers. The second detail that reveals the inward dynamics of this family is that Jacob didn't even attempt to hide the fact that Joseph was his favorite. Verse 3 says that he loved him more than any of his other sons because he was the son of his old age. And that's kind of an odd way to say that, considering the fact that Benjamin was actually the last born, the youngest son. So in the most literal sense, Benjamin was actually the son of Jacob's old age as the youngest child. But theologically speaking, this phrase has a connection back to chapter 21, where we read that Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age. So in the same way that after years of suffering from barrenness and being unable to have children of her own, finally Sarah, the wife that Abraham loved, was able to conceive and bore a son, Isaac. Likewise, after years of suffering from barrenness and being unable to have children of her own, finally Rachel, the wife that Jacob loved, was able to conceive and bear a son, Joseph. And so there's a connection there, and because of that, Jacob had a special place in his heart for Joseph, and unfortunately, didn't even remotely try to hide it. Actually, just the opposite. Rather than at least pretending to not play favorites, instead, Jacob gave Joseph a special robe, which was a symbol of his special affection. Now, unfortunately, Hollywood and Broadway have given us some bad ideas of what this was. There's no indication that it was literally a Technicolor dream coat. In fact, the phrase many colors was derived from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, but the most literal translation from the Hebrew is actually just a long-sleeved tunic. The only other place this phrase is used in the Old Testament is 2 Samuel 13, where it's describing a long-sleeved royal robe. So whether or not it was actually sewn together and pieced together with elaborate, beautiful colors, we actually don't really know that detail for sure. But what we do know is that it was a long, royal-style garment that symbolized regency and favor. So it was long-sleeved and probably reached all the way down to the ground. And a robe like that, if it was going to be given to anyone, would have been given typically to the firstborn son in the family, but Jacob gave it to his 11th born son because Joseph was the firstborn son of Rachel, which was the only one of his 4 wives that he truly loved. So those two details provide us with some of the intel that we need to understand the relational dynamics in this family. Joseph was a suck-up and a tattletale. Jacob loved him more than his other sons, didn't even try to hide it, so much so that he gave him this special robe. And because of these details, Moses says Joseph's brothers hated him. Now, maybe you've experienced some sibling rivalry in your time with your siblings. Maybe you've had situations where you've been really frustrated with your siblings or irritated by them, or maybe even just downright angry with them, or maybe you had a tiff with one of them for a duration of time or something like that. That's really not what's going on here. Joseph's brothers were not just unhappy. They weren't just angry. This wasn't just like a relational tiff. They were filled with hatred. They hated him so much, it says they couldn't even bear to speak a kind word to him. So in the same way that Jacob wasn't even trying to pretend to not play favorites, Joseph's brothers weren't even trying to pretend to like him. They couldn't even muster up enough willpower to just speak a kind, peaceful word to him. They straight up hated this kid. Well, as it turns out, they're about to hate him even more. Because at some point, we're not told exactly when, but Joseph has a set of 2 dreams. In the first dream, he and his brothers are out harvesting, tying up sheaves of grain in the field. And during this dream, all of a sudden, his sheaf of grain stands up straight and tall, and all of his brothers' sheaves fall down before him and bow down to him in submission to his sheaf. And then in the second dream, it goes even further, because during this dream, 11 stars are bowing down to him, which symbolized his brothers. But on top of that, the sun and the moon are also bowing down to him, which symbolized his father and his mother, which is kind of interesting because his mother Rachel at this point had already passed away. But nonetheless, Joseph had 2 dreams, and in both of them, he was presented with his entire family bowing down in submission to him. Now, setting aside the doctrine of God's sovereignty for just a moment, as we're going to see, God's sovereignty is very much involved in this story. But if I could just kind of jump in a time machine and go back in time to this chapter, just from a strictly pragmatic perspective, I feel like I would want to just grab this 17-year-old kid and kind of pull him aside and be like, Joseph, listen, buddy, cool coat and everything, but you got to hear me. Your brothers hate you. They really, really hate you. So these dreams that you had, you should probably just keep them to yourself. It's not going to help anything. It's going to make everything worse. I know you're young. I know you're excited to share these dreams that you've had, but trust me, it's not going to go well. Just keep it to yourself. Honestly, as a modern day reader, the details of this story, they're kind of painful to read because we can see that Joseph is somewhat of a spoiled brat. It's not that he's evil, but he's just immature. And we can see how much his brothers already hate him. And he's about to make everything so much worse by telling him about these dreams. Well, painful as it is to read, he tells his brothers and his father about his dreams. He tells his brothers about the sheaves and tells them that all of them were bowing down to him. And he tells his dad even about this other dream and about the stars and the sun and the moon and how all of them are bowing down in submission to him. And the response of his brothers is pretty predictable because they hate him already. So they're like, hey, you're going to rule over us, huh? You're going to reign over us, big shot. Okay. And then Jacob responds somewhat forcefully in his own way. He says, what is this about? You think your brothers and your mother and I are going to bow down to you? So as much as Jacob loves and favors Joseph, it doesn't seem like he's particularly thrilled with the dream. But we're told in verse 11 that his brothers were jealous of him, but that his father kept these things in mind. In other words, even though Jacob wasn't particularly thrilled about Joseph's dreams, he seemed to understand that there's a chance these dreams are actually from the Lord. That there's a chance this might actually come to pass. And because of that, he's kind of filing them away for later in his mind, keeping them in the back of his head just to see if that might actually happen. So we got to keep moving, but in this first part of our passage, we see this one spoiled dreamer. As Joseph was favored by his father and he had these dreams about his family members bowing down in submission to him, right? And then in our second movement, we see 10 jealous schemers now as the story continues in verses 12 through 36. It's a longer chunk, but we're going to go ahead and read through it anyway. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he said to him, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring me word." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. And a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. They saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say that a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what will become of his dreams." But when Reuben heard it, he rescued him out of their hands, saying, "Let us not take his life." And Reuben said to them, "Shed no blood, Throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand to restore him to their father." So when Joseph came near to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit, and the pit was empty, there was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat. And looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead with their camels bearing gum, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, "What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, and let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother, our own flesh." And his brothers listened to him. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes and returned to his brothers and said, "The boy is gone, and where shall I go?" Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, "This we have found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not." And he identified it and said, "It is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces." Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All of his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning." Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. All right, we need to move pretty quickly through this second section, but the reason that I labeled this part of the chapter 10 jealous schemers rather than 11 is because Benjamin, Jacob's youngest brother, is not involved in any of this. Most scholars put a 6 to 10 year age gap between Joseph and Benjamin. So Joseph being 17, Benjamin is still just a child. He's most certainly just back home with his father. So the 10 jealous schemers in this passage are Joseph's 10 older brothers. And all of those older brothers are on a trip shepherding their father's flock near the city of Shechem. Now, if you've been with us for at least the last few weeks, that should sound a little bit of an alarm in your head, because Shechem was the setting of chapter 34, where Jacob's daughter Dinah was abused and defiled, and then his sons Simeon and Levi killed all of the Shechemite men in this act of crazed revenge. And then they got out of there, and now for some reason his sons have gone back to Shechem to pasture Jacob's flock. Which means most likely Jacob is left wondering if his sons are still safe. They've gone back to this place of this bloody massacre, so he wants to make sure that they're all okay, that they're all safe. So he sends Joseph to go check on them, which is extremely stupid considering the danger that surrounded them in Shechem. But he thinks this is a good idea. He sends Joseph nonetheless, and when he arrives there, he encounters this man who tells them that he overheard them and saw them leave and go to a different place called Dothan, which now means that Joseph is traveling nearly 65 miles from his home in order to go find his brothers in Dothan in obedience to his father. And when he arrives there, his brothers spot him off approaching in the distance, probably a silhouette, most likely a silhouette that was impossible to miss because of his big royal robe just kind of wafting in the wind. They can see him off in the distance approaching. His 10 jealous brothers see him and they begin scheming against him, and they say, "Here comes the dreamer in that stupid robe. We should just kill him. Let's kill him and let's throw him in a pit, and we can just tell Dad that he was killed by a wild animal, and we'll just be rid of him." This is the level of hate and envy that they had toward Joseph. But the oldest brother, Reuben, has actually a pretty decent moment, even though last week he slept with one of his father's wives, so he's not a good dude. But thankfully, he interjects into these plans, and he says, "Guys, we cannot kill him. He's our brother. Let's not spill his blood. Just toss him alive in this pit. Leave him to fend for himself." And then he doesn't say this to them, but Moses gives us a clue in the narrative that Reuben's plan was actually to go then rescue Joseph out of the pit and take him back to his father, probably as a way to try to get back into his father's good graces after what he had done with one of his father's wives. But they take his advice, and when Joseph finally arrives to greet his brothers, they rip off that royal robe, throw him in a pit, leave him to fend for himself in what was most likely an empty water cistern that was probably 10 to 15 feet deep, making it nearly impossible to climb out by yourself. So with Joseph in a pit and his royal robe in their possession, his brothers sit down to eat some dinner together, which is just incredible. Like, they hate him so much that they can throw him in a pit and then just go break bread. That's what they think of him. And as they do so, they spot a group of travelers, and immediately Jacob's son Judah sees dollar signs. He sees this caravan of Ishmaelites, which Moses is also calling the Midianites. They're headed over to Egypt to do some trading of things there, and Joseph says, guys, I got it. Judah says, guys, I got it. Killing Joseph won't make us a profit. Leaving him in a pit won't make us a profit. Let's just sell him to these travelers. That way we will be rid of him forever, plus we'll make some money. He sees dollar signs. Well, that sounds much better to his brothers than just walking away empty-handed, so they all agree to do it, and they seem to do it without Reuben, actually, apparently, because Reuben is shocked and devastated when he eventually goes back to the pit and discovers that Joseph is no longer there, but the rest of the brothers conspire together and sell Joseph to these travelers for 20 shekels of silver, and he is taken down to Egypt. Now, real quick, I want to address a small difficulty with the text because I don't want anybody to be confused based on the different translation. In the ESV, which is what we preach from here, verse 28 says this: Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. So that makes it sound like the Midianites and the Ishmaelites are two different groups of people, and the Midianites were actually the ones who grabbed Joseph out of the pit and then sold him to the Ishmaelites, who then took him away. It makes it sound like the brothers weren't actually involved in the transaction. But most other translations say something more like this: When the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites, who took him to Egypt. That's from the NIV. So I actually think in this instance, the ESV translated this verse in kind of a messy and confusing way, because later on in the story, in Genesis 45, verse 4, Joseph specifically tells his brothers, specifically says that they sold him into slavery. And then in the New Testament, Acts chapter 7, Stephen says the patriarchs, jealous of Joseph, sold him into Egypt. So even though this verse in the ESV is kind of confusing, we just kind of use the rest of the Bible to make sense of it, let Scripture interpret Scripture, and it is clear that Joseph's brothers were the ones who sold him into slavery, which means Moses is just using these terms, Ishmaelites and Midianites, kind of interchangeably in this passage. They purchased Joseph and took him down to Egypt. But after selling their brother, they need to cover their tracks. So they slaughter a goat and they cover Joseph's royal robe in blood, make it look like he was killed by a wild animal, and they take it back to their father and they present it to him, and he is completely heartbroken. This is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without a doubt torn to pieces. And he weeps bitterly and he mourns for his son, and his family tries to comfort him, and he refuses to be comforted because as far as he knows, Rachel and now Rachel's firstborn son are both dead. But in reality, Joseph has been taken down to Egypt, and upon arrival, he is sold for a second time for another profit to a wealthy man named Potiphar, who was an officer that worked for Pharaoh. Now, this chapter purposely ends with a cliffhanger. So if all we had was this chapter, it's really bad. But Joseph's story is far from over. In fact, it continues on for another 13 chapters. But despite this passage being a cliffhanger, it's really impossible actually to properly understand and apply this chapter without doing so in light of the rest of Joseph's story, because it all works together. Because even though right now it seems like Joseph is just a complete goner, and it seems like his life is basically over and there's nothing but dark days ahead for him, the truth is, what this passage actually shows us is that God is always doing more than meets the eye. God is always doing more than meets the eye. See, obviously, there's still a lot of gaps in Joseph's story that need to be filled in, and they will be filled in throughout the next several weeks as we walk through this. But what we're going to see along the way is that eventually God sovereignly raises up Joseph to a position of power in Egypt. And years later, his family, in order to survive this deadly famine in Canaan, are forced to travel to Egypt for food so that they don't die of starvation. And then Joseph, as a very powerful man, is finally reunited with his family in Egypt. And when that happens, he says this to his brothers: "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." In other words, even though Joseph's brothers were doing something heinous and evil and terrible to him, God was doing something else entirely to him. I joked earlier about jumping in a time machine and going back in time to warn Joseph that your brothers hate you too much. Don't talk about this dream. But what's amazing to think about is that every single detail of this story was part of God's sovereign plan to save his covenant people from dying in a famine. So think about it. If Joseph was not a spoiled brat, his brothers probably would not have hated him. If Jacob hadn't given him that royal robe, his brother's hate for him would not have grown. If the Lord had not given Joseph those dreams, which we do know that they were from the Lord and they ultimately do actually come to pass in some serious ways, if the Lord had not given him these dreams and Joseph had not told his family about these dreams, then his brother's hate would not have grown for him even more, to the point where they decide to throw him in a pit and sell him into slavery. And if that had not happened, Joseph would not have been raised to a position of power in Egypt. And if that had not happened, Joseph would not have stored up enough food in Egypt to survive the famine. And if that had not happened, then God's covenant people would have died off about 3,800 years ago from starvation. And if that were the case, then God's promise in Genesis 3:15 about the seed of the woman and God's promise to Abraham and to his descendants would have died off as well. So even though on the surface it looks like Jacob's life was over and this was really nothing but an awful, unredeemable situation, God was doing something that none of them could see at the time. So to come back to our question from earlier, have you ever felt like God left you out to dry? Have you ever felt like you're going through challenging or confusing times in your personal life and you've prayed and you've cried out to God and it just didn't seem like Jesus showed up? If so, the story of Joseph shows us God is always doing more than meets the eye. Now, just to be clear, here's what I don't mean by that, okay? I do not mean that the life of Joseph gives us license to just take his story and ipso facto map it over top of our stories. So I'm not saying, hey, when life is hard, just be patient because that Joseph-like breakthrough is just around the corner. God raised Joseph up to a place of power. Eventually, if you just keep the faith, he's going to do the exact same thing for you. That's what we learned from this story. If you ever hear a preacher say that, run away. That is not how this works. That is not what I mean when I say that God is doing more than meets the eye. What I mean is this: life in a fallen world is hard. It's riddled with challenging and confusing times and seasons and situations, but because God is sovereign and faithful and he keeps his promises and he is relentlessly committed to saving his people, then even when on the surface things look totally unredeemable, God is always working in ways that we cannot see, which means we need to trust the author of life to be the perfect author of our individual lives. Many of you know that prior to the Lord calling me into pastoral ministry and before seminary and all of that, I worked in sales for about a decade. And one of the companies that I worked for, they used to do these sales exercises for us to try to kind of keep each other's craft sharp. And honestly, they were incredibly dumb and annoying, but they were a requirement. And there was this one time where we were instructed to kind of break off in pairs, and I was told to take the pen, like in my inside pocket of my blazer, take the pen out of your blazer and sell it in a way that makes it sound amazing. So I rolled my eyes and just played along and kind of had some fun with it. And I said, okay, you see this pen. To the naked eye, it seems like just a normal pen. It's a black pen with a little clicky thing on top, and it writes in normal black ink. Looks like a totally normal pen. But what you can't see is that every time I write something down with this pen, it always happens. So whatever I write down, as long as I'm writing it down with this pen, it doesn't matter what it is. If I write it down with this pen, it always happens. And my coworker grabbed the pen out of my hand and wrote something down and covered it up and waited a second, and then he goes, I don't think it works. And then he showed me the paper, and it said, Cindy Crawford is my wife. He was single, don't worry. And I was like, dude, not even a magic pen would work for that. But honestly, and then I said, you didn't listen closely enough. I said, whatever I write down with this pen always happens. I didn't say anything about you. Whatever I write down with this pen always happens. And he's like, fine, write down that Cindy Crawford is my wife. And I said, no, the exercise is over. Sometimes this is how we treat God. He has told us that He alone is the author of life, who is sovereign over all things. He told us that He alone has decreed the end from the beginning, and that whatever He says will come to pass is going to come to pass. And we know that He has never told us that whatever we want to happen is always going to happen. And yet, despite knowing that, we want to be the authors of our own lives. We want to be able to script and write out our own story, and we get frustrated with God when things don't go a certain way, even though He never told us that's how it works. And the reality is, if Joseph had been able to write his own story and been the author of his own life, he would not have chosen any of these things. None of these things would have happened, and God's greater purposes of redemption for His people would have never been accomplished. And likewise, if we were the authors of our lives, then on the surface, things might seem nice for a while, but God's greater purposes for us and for His world would never be accomplished. So we need to trust that the author of life is the perfect author of our lives. I've shared this quote before, but I think it's worth repeating this morning. In his book, Gentle and Lowly, Dane Ortland writes this, quote, "Perhaps looking at the evidence of your life, you do not know what to conclude except that the mercy of God in Christ has passed you up. Maybe you've been deeply mistreated, misunderstood, betrayed by the one person you should have been able to trust, abandoned, taken advantage of. Perhaps you carry a pain with you that will never fully heal until you are gone. If my life is any evidence of the mercy of God in Christ, you might think to yourself, then I'm not impressed. Well, then to you I say, the evidence of Christ's mercy toward you is not your life. The evidence of His mercy toward you is His life. Mistreated, misunderstood, betrayed, abandoned in your place. If God sent His own Son to walk through the valley of condemnation, rejection, and hell, then you can trust Him as you walk through your own valleys on your way to heaven. See, the story of Joseph's life is an unmistakable foreshadowing of the life of Christ. Because Jesus was the eternally favored Son who was the object of His heavenly Father's special affection and was robed in majesty from eternity past. But when His Father sent Him on a mission to go gather His people together, He was met with hatred and jealousy and anger, and He was betrayed by His own people, and He was sold for 30 pieces of silver, and He was beaten and crucified and left in a pit for 3 days, until He was lifted out of that pit and raised to a position of power with all authority in heaven and on earth being given to Him. And because of that, everyone who repents of their sin and believes in Him is rescued from spiritual famine and gets to live with Him forever in the family of God. The author of life wrote a script for his own life that involved pain and suffering and rejection and abandonment and sadness and grief. He chose it for himself so that by his life, death, resurrection, and dominion, we could be robed in God's grace and special affection that was bought with his own blood. So if you're feeling like God has left you out to dry, if you're feeling like Jesus just has not shown up for you, I just want to lovingly remind you that Jesus showed up for you in a way that nobody else could. In a way that no other author ever would. And because of that, we can trust the author of life to be the perfect author of our lives, and we need to remember that the story isn't over. Joseph's story, even though this is a cliffhanger, isn't over. Our story isn't over, and we know how it ends. We know that we're headed for a new heavens and a new earth in the perfect presence of God forever, with no pain, no suffering, ever again. As Paul Tripp says, your world is not out of control, it's just out of your control. In other words, even when on the surface things look totally unredeemable and we can't make sense of it, we rest in knowing God is always doing more than meets the eye.